I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews. You can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, I want to welcome author, journalist, and Silicon Valley entrepreneur Sarah Lacy. A graduate of Rhodes College, she has served as CEO of TechWorld's Pando and a chairman mom. She was also a columnist for Business Week and hosted Yahoo's online web video show Tech Ticker. And she was a columnist for TechCrunch. And in 2012, she founded the technology news site Pando Daily, and Forbes named her that year as one of the world's 20 most influential businesswomen. Her books include Once You're Lucky, Twice You're Good, and How the Top 1% of Entrepreneurs Profit from Global Chaos, and most recently, a book with a provocative and unusual title, A Uterus is a Feature, Not a Bug. She now owns and operates Best Bookstore in Palm Springs, California. And welcome, Sarah Lacy.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. I want to begin with kind of a question that I think will suit you because you were a leading tech journalist and still live in that world, especially with the Putin scare that has gone into many of us who felt we were championing Ukraine for being invaded. Things are taking a really dark turn now. Are we in a kind of oligarchy now of tech bros?
Yes.
And Trump?
Yes. I mean, yes, absolutely. And here's the thing. People in Silicon Valley, and not writ large, one of the things that bothers me, and it's like, I used to always say, like, nothing ruins a great storyline like reporting, right? And I think right now the media keeps saying Silicon Valley, and what they mean is a handful of people. They mean Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk and a few other people. As you and I know, Silicon Valley is thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And there are many, many people who, the views of this oligarchy do not represent. And so, like, let's be very precise and clear with what we're talking about. We're talking about that handful of people. History will show that picture from the inauguration, which is Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk. Like, we know the handful of people we're talking about, right?
David Sachs.
Yeah, David Sachs. Like, we know the people who were like, yep, let's do this all in, right? Literally all in. That's the name of the podcast. So, but yeah, I mean, there is the job of a venture capitalist is to essentially identify founders that they think are going to be able to shape the future and be the ones that are going to be able to be the contrarian change makers that are going to upend the world, disrupt the world. And there has been a view, really since the Steve Jobs era, that everyone doubled down on in the Travis Kalanick, in the Adam Newman era of, hey, if these people are morally problematic, we're cool with that. If we don't like these people, we are cool with that. And I think that is how this world viewed Donald Trump. It was, Peter Thiel was the first one. Peter Thiel is a brilliant contrarian. He saw this before anyone else in the first campaign of Donald Trump. He made the contrarian bet of investing in Donald Trump the same way you would invest in an entrepreneur. And the second time around, let's call it Donald Trump's B round, more venture capitalists came in, the same way Peter Thiel invested in Mark Zuckerberg, and then everyone else wanted to come into the B round. So what we've seen essentially is a bunch of venture capitalists have bought shares in America via Donald Trump. And they're okay with his behavior, and they've bought shares of America, and they're being repaid for those shares. They've bought equity stakes in America. So is that an oligarchy by definition? Yeah.
Yeah, it is an oligarchy. It's also depressing in some ways but some would say it's pragmatic and, it's the nature of doing business and doing venture capital and all that. It seems to be a kind of moral crash, though, in many ways.
But I think that's how they morally rationalize it, right? That they're doing their job. And they think, look, we're representing pension funds, we're representing endowments. Like, no one wakes up in the morning thinking I'm going to be the villain, right? They don't wake up and twirl their mustache. Everyone has their way that they're rationalizing it. And my view is that's how they're rationalizing it. They're doing their job. They're returning value to shareholders. And, unfortunately, we now have to all live in their startup. I remember when Tony Hsieh took over downtown Vegas, right? You remember this story.
Yeah.
And he had $300 million and he was going to remake downtown Vegas. And it was a story that my partner Paul and I covered up close when we were building Pando. And we were very critical of it, even though, I had a lot of respect for Tony and what he built with Zappos and was friends with him. But we were very critical because it was like, look, a lot of people who live in downtown Vegas didn't elect you mayor and didn't agree to live inside your startup. And it was not, a lot of changes he made in the city, they didn't opt into. They didn't opt into living inside of a startup. Living inside of a startup is chaotic. You're moving fast and breaking things, right? As we are very literally seeing with the federal government right now.
And nobody elected Musk.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing now with the federal government. We are all living inside of a startup, whether we like it or not.
It's sobering to think. Well, I remember over a decade ago when you were running Pando, Emil Michael talked about digging up dirt and all the rest of that sort of thing. Is that kind of toxic boys club still really what haunts Silicon Valley? I mean, it's been characterized as such by a number of feminists like yourself. And it's in some minds, gotten worse. That hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, whatever you want to call it, is exacerbated because of Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing in the world generally now is a real bifurcation. Like it's not an accident that, and I'm hardly the first person to observe this, that what happened with Trump happened after we had our first Black president. And that I think that the extremely ugly and disturbing backlash against trans rights has happened after we have had tremendous strides in terms of, you look at the generational differences between what trans kids are able to do and the awareness and acceptance of what trans kids are able to be versus the generation, my generation of people who are transgender in my generation. And it's stunning. It's a stunning difference. And that freaked people out. And I think when there's people who want to cling to the past, I think when you have huge leaps forward, it freaks them out and they want to suddenly pull backwards. And so I think it's this bifurcation. I think there's a lot of parts of Silicon Valley where we are seeing huge leaps forward. And I think that means people want to pull back. And so I think you have both at once. I think the good news about Silicon Valley, as I said, these 6 people do not make up all of Silicon Valley. I think if you look at the numbers, San Francisco was still the biggest metro area where the fewest people voted for Donald Trump. New York was something like 20%. San Francisco was like 10, 12%. It was still, overwhelmingly a place that didn't vote for Donald Trump. So as much as everyone wants to write the headlines of, oh, Silicon Valley has turned, so MAGA, we're still really talking about a pretty small movement within. And now, yes, because of the sheer number of dollars, has that small movement transformed the country and the world? Absolutely. But there's still a lot of Silicon Valley that is very progressive, that is very pro-DEI, that doesn't represent this. And so I think what bums me out is because the media has so fixated on this handful of people, I worry that there's a lot of incredible diverse talent that's looking at this and not moving to Silicon Valley because they think there's no place for them. But yeah, I mean, Trump has given people like Emil Michael permission to do things like they threatened to do to me. And in fact, Emil Michael has a job in the government now, which is absolutely terrifying. I mean, I'm kind of scared to get on a plane. He's got a lot of scores to settle with me. I ruined his Google results for all time.
I mean, you talk about a handful of people. Let me do a devil's advocate number here with you about trans rights, because I just heard Victor Davis Hanson, who I'm sure you could easily vilify probably, though he's a pretty good historian and he's a smart guy that a lot of people listen to, maybe too many people. He's on Fox all the time now. He's become a favorite of Megyn Kelly's. And what he says is you got a very small percentage of people who have gender dysphoria, and now it's become a civil rights issue, and that's wrong. It's wrong because ideologically it doesn't make sense, and yet that's what the Democrats have put their strengths behind. And it's turned off a lot of blue-collar people throughout America, and they don't want to see somebody who's changed their gender competing, in a swimming or pole vaulting or whatever, when they were born biologically in endocrinology to another gender. The example of what's going on in Maine now with the governor of Maine, and she's pretty tough, and I really admire her toughness. You have to, but at the same time, when Trump says to her, you're not representing the popular will of the people here, maybe he's right.
No, it isn't. This is a manufactured issue. Before, this was created as an issue because they had already won on Roe versus Wade and they needed a new issue. This is a manufactured issue. You go back to before they started talking about this being an issue with let's protect women in the bathrooms, let's protect women in sports. No one cared about this. No one was up in arms about this. You know why? Because I guarantee, any of these people so worried about this, you go to a school and you pick out the trans kid. You can't, because they're just girls, they're just boys, and they're not upsetting anyone. This is a manufactured issue that has convinced people to get upset. It's just like the movie Wicked. It's like the wizard says, you give them a real good enemy, that's how you distract them from the price of eggs. It is a made-up issue no one was upset about. And I'll tell you, Michael, here's how you know. Because actually, while everyone's waving their hands about sports, because that sounds reasonable, look at the actual legislation that's getting passed. It's taking away the rights for parents to make healthcare decisions about their kids. It is messing with kids' ability to, there are many, many, many studies that show the mental health differences of kids getting gender affirming care. Why are you in the middle of that for families' decisions? It is saying that parents can go to jail for a healthcare decision they make for their kids. Why are you in the middle of that? And in certain states, there are laws where if a trans kid is in an accident, a member of an ER can refuse to save their life on religious grounds. No, 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 no. This isn't someone doing a pole vaulting event. You've made that up. It's so, so, so disingenuous. And no one was upset about it.
Well, is it a manufactured issue, though? Because I know a lot of blue-collar people got upset, and it was very smart of the GOP running ads of Kamala talking about we have to put money behind, this would be citizen taxpayer money, behind sex change operations for people who are incarcerated or for people who are undocumented.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it was a manufactured issue that's gone back a couple cycles, and it started to become a manufactured issue once they got they filled the seats on the Supreme Court, and they no longer could run on Roe versus Wade. And as everyone has pointed out, even with all of these cuts that Elon Musk has been doing with Doge, it's a drop in the bucket. None of this is making a difference. The only thing that makes a real difference in taxpayer dollars is going to be cutting Social Security or Medicaid. There was actually someone from a quite conservative think tank that was like, yeah, please do send refund checks for all of the cuts you've made to the American public, because they're going to get pennies on the dollar, and it will be one of the best civic economic lessons that has ever happened to the American people. All of these job losses, all of this carnage, it makes absolutely no difference in terms of the overall deficit, in terms of this amount of money taxpayers are saying. The idea that there's some great amount of money going to sex changes, it was made up. It was not an issue that was enraging anyone. There were absolutely no blue-collar people walking around upset about trans kids, because if you go to an elementary school, you cannot spot the trans kid because they are kids. They are girls and they are boys. And no blue-collar person was upset, because I guarantee you they can't spot the trans kid because they are girls and they are boys.
Well, we could spend a good deal of time on this, but I want to
And I'm happy to.
Well, first I want to find out why you and Kara Swisher had a falling out, because I used to interview the two of you together, and Kara Swisher now is in a kind of limelight. She's become sort of a stellar figure, you would concede?
Look, I will say, I already made one Wicked reference. Here, I'll make another Wicked reference. I think, and I would say I would cast myself in the role of Elphaba, and I'd put Kara Swisher's Glinda. I think, like a lot of rivalries, we're a lot alike, and I think both of us have a lot of professional respect for one another. I think we went about our jobs very differently, and I think Kara Swisher had a conference for which she was gifted from the Wall Street Journal, which did $10 million or something like that of revenue, which she had to protect. And so she had to do a lot of access journalism as a result. I went to that conference for many years. We were very good friends. I was kicked out of that conference because I made Travis Kalanick uncomfortable. I would call that journalism. I would call what I did journalism. I would call kicking me out of a conference for making a billionaire uncomfortable not journalism. I would call the fact that she waited for the world to come to the consensus that what Travis Kalanick was doing at Uber was not okay, years after I made him uncomfortable for that. And then her belatedly getting on the bandwagon, I would call that not journalism. She would call that journalism. Now, look, people make mistakes. I get it. Had she said, hey, you know what? That was a bad call. I'm sorry. Water under the bridge. Kara's a very stubborn person. I'm a very stubborn person. I'm still waiting on my apology. We have not spoken since that time. That having been said, I have massive respect for her. I think she has come around. I think the work she's doing, calling out a lot of people very belatedly after she was very nice to them to sit on her stage, has been impressive. Her book did tremendously well. Kudos. It is very, very hard to write a book about tech that does that well. I know, because I own a bookstore and no one wants to buy books about tech billionaires. I think she's been doing incredible work. So a lot of respect for her. But, this whole such a feared journalist. Oh, God. I mean, the marketing that woman does while cozying up to billionaires and kicking out journalists who make them uncomfortable, golf clap, Kara Swisher.
Well, when you talk about what is and isn't journalism, what's your sense of the AP being excluded from the White House and possibly other, shall we say, in Trump's eyes, not acceptable news media? I mean, because that seems to be the trajectory now that may be in front of us, or Bezos, for that matter, bending his knee and saying, the opinions page has to follow a certain rule now, and if you don't like it, get out.
I mean, it's terrifying. I mean, I think it's great that the AP is not bending, because it's like, look, we're in a situation.
This is the public's right to know, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also, they have to not bend, because right now it's the Gulf of Mexico. What's it going to be next? We're in we have an administration that is insisting on news organizations and social media organizations and information organizations like Google parroting propaganda lines. And right now, the trial balloon is the Gulf of Mexico. What's the problem? It's just changing the name. This is an Overton window, and this is the trial balloon. And I think, for me, it makes me trust what the AP is going to say a lot more. Now, does that mean they're having to do journalism from the outside? Sure. But having been a journalist, you can do journalism from the outside. You can get reporting from the outside. It's harder, but you can certainly do it. And I think it makes a stance that AP, whatever they report, it is not going to have the stamp of White House approved on it. Is this ideal? No, but this is the world we're in. We're in a world now where the White House is only allowing journalism that is, propaganda allowed journalism. And I think the Bezos thing is terrifying and sad. It's sad that we're at a place where, and we've always been at a place, like going back to the Graham family, the Sacklers, all of the wealthy families that started all of the great media outlets of this country. We've always been at a place where media cannot be done unless wealthy families subsidize it. And people talk about the internet killed media. It's always been this way. The really, really good journalism cannot be done unless a wealthy family subsidizes it. And unfortunately, wealthy families became billionaires, and billionaires bought stakes in America, and they want to protect that investment. And it's unfortunate.
Well, you got subsidized by some millionaires and billionaires. I mean,
I did. And that was controversial at the time. And the way we did it was we took money from almost everyone. No one had a board seat. No one had a huge stake. And we covered everyone equally terribly. And by the end of it, none of our investors spoke to us. We had, I think, almost all of Uber's—
You had Andreessen, in fact, didn't you?
We did. And almost all of Uber's cap table was also investors in Pando. I mean, if you want to think about, did we curry favor with our investors? I mean, most of them did not speak to us. Peter Thiel was an investor in Pando. And I think one of the last articles we wrote, the headline was something like, "No, Peter Thiel really is just an a-hole." I mean, I defy anyone to look at the archives of Pando and think our investors made a difference. But, look, I wasn't independently wealthy. So, I made the decision of, we got to raise money if we're going to do real journalism. So I'm going to raise a tiny bit from everyone so everyone's equally conflicted, and give no one a meaningful stake in the company that they can hold over us, and give no one a board seat. I wish I had been like Jessica, the owner of The Information, where I had family money and I could subsidize it. But unfortunately, I didn't.
There are a couple of big names in Silicon Valley who still have reputations of not necessarily being fall guys for this present administration. I'm thinking about Reid Hoffman, who I think was also an investor. Thinking of Jack Selby, who is a major investor still. So the few who belong to kind of the Cosa Nostra that you're talking about, there are exceptions. There remain exceptions.
Yeah, and another interesting one is Dustin Moskovitz, who is the other founder of Facebook. He was a huge backer and sort of a co-backer with Reid in the Democratic Party. I mean, that's got to be an interesting little Facebook reunion between he and Mark Zuckerberg. Another interesting conversation I imagine right now is Airbnb board meetings. Brian Chesky has been very, very quiet, and Joe Gebbia, who was Airbnb's co-founder, is now been sort of outed as a member of Doge. I think that everything I know about Brian, I've not spoken to him. I don't think he shares those views. We're really, and Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel were best friends. We have really seen Silicon Valley families and friends ripped apart with this
We did a
administration.
podcast with Chip Conley. You mentioned Airbnb. Chip Conley is sort of more on your side, one of the good guys. I mean, as I said, they're still scattered around in that world.
Yeah, a lot of them. I mean, I probably can count on. I think it can stretch to two hands, the billionaires that still speak to me. barely to two hands.
Well, the billionaires, certainly under this Trump administration, are going to get more and more wealthy. I mean, the reality is, especially if we're going to get minerals out of Ukraine and all of this sort of thing, it's going to help Tesla. It's going to help Musk. Musk is getting great advantages out of his buzzsaw behavior or whatever he's trying to do.
Yeah, well,
just firing people left and right like he did with Tesla.
No, and the budget that just got passed, we're cutting, food for poor people and Medicaid to give billionaires tax cuts.
So when did you become like an ardent feminist, which you are? In fact, I saw you talking about your two kids, and you said one is a Disney princess and the other one is a feminist warrior or social warrior feminist or something. Maybe that's a little bit of the division that you still have. Girl from Tennessee. I don't know. I'm guessing here. But you become kind of a anti-patriarch, sort of hardcore feminist.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. I've thought about that a lot, and I don't know that I was ever not feminist. I was raised in the South, but I was raised by a mother who, grew up in the 1950s in Jacksonville, Florida, but was extremely smart and always kind of resented that, my parents were both academics. And I think my mother always resented that she could never quite have the career my father did, because I think she felt that she was smarter than my father, or at least as smart as my father. She was a high school teacher, but she had 5 kids and didn't go back to teaching until I was the youngest until I was in school. Whereas my dad got to have this celebrated career as a college professor. And I think my mom always kind of resented that, and she should have. And so I think, she and I were very close because she went back to school and she taught at the school I was at. So we rode to school every day. And I think she just kind of always put in my head, like, this is BS. Like, you should absolutely do whatever you want. So I think even though my mom would have never identified as a feminist, I was very much raised by a feminist. And I went to an all-girls school. And so even though I was raised in the South, I went to an all-girls school, which was very you guys should do whatever you want. And so I just was never, when I read Lean In when it came out, I was never raised with that thing of, oh, I can't raise my hand in class or I'll never get a date. Like, I just kind of was almost inoculated into this Wonder Woman Island sort of part of the South where I didn't have any of those pressures. And then, I came to Silicon Valley and I just kind of had this sense of, I'm going to do my job and I don't really care. I think what really openly radicalized me much more was when I had children. And I think I remember vividly when there was this wild moment of TechCrunch had been bought by AOL. I was supposed to become the editor-in-chief of TechCrunch after Michael Arrington. And I went into labor with Eli, my first kid. And while I was in labor, there was this whole thing going down where Arianna Huffington, who was our boss now at AOL, was trying to oust Michael Arrington from the company. And she didn't know I was supposed to take over as the editor-in-chief. It was super messy. Anyway, net, she ended up giving my job away to someone else while I was in labor. Which, my friend of me, Kara Swisher, called her out at a dinner at Sheryl Sandberg's house. So that was one solid that Kara Swisher did for me. And so I kind of had this moment where I came home after giving birth and I realized that Arianna Huffington, who's supposed to be this champion for women, had given my job away while I was in labor. And I had two choices. I could either go back to TechCrunch and suck it up and take a different job, even though my job had been given away, or I could take my baby fundraising and start a company to do something else. And I think a lot of people who, or I wouldn't say a lot of people, I would say my conception before having a child would have been coming home with a new baby. I would have gone back to TechCrunch and taken the paycheck and just taken the easy life because Jesus, I have a baby. I don't need any problems. But what happened was I looked down and I saw this baby and I thought, man, I've got to be this baby's role model. I've got to be this baby's role model for what a strong woman is in this world. And, that baby and I went up and down Sand Hill Road and raised $2.5 million because I needed to show that baby that this is what we do when some woman gives our job away. And I do think that that's what radicalized me. I took very seriously, I need to show these kids what it is to be a woman in the world.
So that was the baby that became the feminist warrior?
That's the Disney princess.
Oh, that's a Disney princess. You would have expected you're showing her all that feminist muscle.
But she's also pretty fierce. I think that's slightly dated. She's out of her Disney princess phase a bit. She's in her very sassy teen phase.
Now you've also taken on the role of supermom in many ways. I mean, running Chairman Mom, I always loved that title because it reflects Chairman Mao, obviously, except it shouldn't be chairman. It should be chairperson and all the rest of that, but we won't even go there. I'm just wondering, though, I have a daughter who's a working mother, and I was thinking about an interview I did years ago with Leslie Stahl, who did a book about being a grandparent, and I said, do a triage number for me, the one piece of advice that you would give grandparents above all other pieces of advice. And she came up with something that was really very valuable. She said, as a grandparent, don't try to impose or give your ideas to your children when they're raising children. Don't push them. Don't push them hard. If you had a piece of advice to give my daughter right at the top, what would it be?
Oh my God, I'm going to tell you the best piece of advice that I got from someone. And I got it from Leslie Gold, who's an incredible PR person in Silicon Valley.
I know her, yeah.
So she told me when I hadn't, because I raised money on maternity leave. I was like, I threw myself into the deep end. And then I had my second daughter 18 months later. So I had 2 kids under 2. And then I got divorced right after. So, and she said, now when they're babies is the time to go crazy with your career because they actually don't need you that much when they're babies. Now is the time that they can have a nanny. They don't need you. They need someone, but they don't need specifically you. And when they're teenagers is when they're going to need you. So do everything you need to do for your career right now, because now is the time you can outsource a lot of stuff to a nanny. But when they're teenagers, you cannot outsource that. And I will tell you, right now we are in that stage, and I am so glad I don't have a startup because she is 100% right. The emotion, it's like the physical load of parenting is so much easier now, but the emotional load of parenting these 2 teen wolves right now is unlike anything I've ever experienced in my life, and no one else can do it. No one else can do it. It's the smartest advice I got. There's absolutely no way I could be doing a startup with them as teenagers.
That makes perfect sense to me, too, because I was very much hands-on. I mean, division of labor with my wife, but the daughter I'm talking about was very rebellious in her teenage years, and she was quite a handful. And we had people who helped us during those baby years because we had careers in front of us. So it makes a good deal of sense, I mean, just personally speaking. I got to get back, though, to trans rights for just a minute, because I was just thinking about other things I want to explore with you, obviously a whole myriad number of things. But I was just thinking about how so many people were angry when, say, somebody who couldn't compete and win as a male became a woman and competed and won. I was thinking about the pole vault thing with Maine, but also swimming. A lot of people who just think that's not fair. If you're born, one way. I mean, talk about as American fairness, having to do with trans rights or whatever notwithstanding, it just doesn't seem fair that somebody, who was a pole vaulter coming in fifth place suddenly gets a sex operation and now is a first place pole vaulter beating out all the competition because changed gender.
Okay, but Michael, let's take you at your word that that's the issue. Okay, then let's change that law. Let's have people have their health care. Let's have parents not put in jail for child abuse. Let's have any other kids who don't want to be athletes. Let's not change people's passports so that someone with a full beard who physically is a man is not in danger going to travel to a country with an F on their passport. It's so disingenuous. If the issue is pole vaulting, let's have a rule for sports, but not every other law that will destroy these people's lives. I'll give you sports. Don't destroy everyone else's life.
Is Hansen right, though, that we're talking about gender dysphoria is such a small, almost non-existent percentage of people? It's below 1%, I think, considerably below 1% who are born with that actual.
I don't think we know, honestly. I think what we do know is it has always been with us. This idea that it's a new thing is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think we know because I think we absolutely abuse people as a society. I think we abuse people as a society. And I think until we are a free society where people are treated with dignity and respect and people feel safe living as themselves, I don't think we know what the numbers are. I think we know from looking at Gen Z, there are larger and larger percentages of queer kids. And there have been larger and larger percentages of genderqueer kids. And that was just because the world was slightly opening up. Let's actually treat these kids with dignity and respect and not drive them to suicide and see.
Well, speaking of numbers, I have to jump to something that I heard you ticking off at one point, and it piqued my curiosity because you were talking about nearly 80% of women less likely to be hired if they have children. That was the figure. And half of them not likely to be promoted if they have children. And I thought to myself, these must come from anonymous sources because men who do hiring wouldn't say, I didn't hire this woman because she had children. So tell me a little bit about where these figures come from.
I think those figures came from the Federal Reserve Bank, actually. And I think, a lot of people do say that. A lot of people do say that. And they're actually, you're now like going back to my book, which I wrote in 2018. And so I'm not sure I remember all the sources, but you would be surprised. First of all, I know many venture capitalists who would say, I can't back you because you're pregnant. They would say, you don't understand. I'm doing you a favor. This is a 24/7 job. You can't do this and have children. When I interviewed at Business Week, it was like a 6-month interview process because, this is back when all you had was the magazine, right? And it was like hard to get a job at Business Week. And I beat out so many people, and it came down to 2 people, me and a guy. I was getting married. I was getting married like in a month. And finally, after 6 months of interviewing, it was me and this guy, and the chief of correspondence sat down with me and said, okay, look, I could get sued for asking you this question. And I was like, uh-huh. And he was like, but I'm going to anyway. And he said, I know you're getting married. Are you planning on having children? And I was not going to get the job if I had said yes, because the implication was writing for Business Week is really hard, and I do not think you can do it if you are going to have children. I don't think you understand how many men actually openly feel that way.
I was on a hiring committee where somebody asked a woman that question, and I was appalled at it. But at that time, there weren't enough laws to protect women from being asked those kinds of questions.
It doesn't. The laws don't matter. The laws don't matter. People still ask it. And one of the other things is that I wrote about at length in my book is this thing about benevolent sexism, where men think they're doing you a favor. So there's this other thing where women go, when they're in a job, they go and they have a baby, they come back, and suddenly, without them even knowing it, they don't get certain promotions because, that promotion would mean you have to travel a lot. And I don't want to do that to her when she's just had a baby. People think they're doing you a favor, but they're actually taking away opportunities from you. This happens all the time. And so, I don't actually think that maybe it would have to be anonymous in terms of people aren't raising their hands and saying, oh yeah, I'm going to take it away from the pregnant woman. But I think people are pretty aware. And I think it's a pretty open bias of, I do not think you can have it all. I think most men and women do not think working women can have it all. Because by the way, we don't give women leave. We don't support childcare. We don't live in a society that expects men to do half of the work. There are very good reasons why we don't think working women can do the same job. We don't have a society that supports it.
So what about the more malevolent side of sexism? Andrew Tate was just welcomed back to the United States, a self-proclaimed misogynist. Our president may have had something to do with that, though he denies it. And there is, a sense of, well, you talk about the patriarchy. What needs to be done, from Sarah Lacy's point of view? How sexist, in a really malevolent sense, a toxic sense, is the world we live in America, or the Western world for that matter, particularly when we have a kind of male hegemony. You talk about patriarchy. I mean, all these strong men we keep hearing about, whether it's Modi in India or Orbán in Hungary or Trump in the United States or Putin in Russia, Xi in China. I mean, this is a world we live in now globally. I don't want to sound a note of pessimism here for those who like to believe in a more androgynous world, or a more, shall we say, less bifurcated, or more, well, let's put it this way, less sexist world. Have any antidotes? Have any ways to diminish all this in your mind?
Well, I think the most hopeful spin that you can put on it is what I was saying earlier. I think this surge is coming because, overall humanity was making progress. And I think, you think about things like the Me Too movement. You think about, this collective sense of women going, oh my God, I had totally normalized this behavior. I had totally normalized this idea of these constant microaggressions were just the cost of me being in the world. I had totally normalized that, of course, because I dressed this way, I was asking for it. All of these things that have we've been fed always. And over the last, 8, 10, 12 years, that spell started getting broken. And so, yes, now this whole thing gets, sort of rears its ugly head. Oh, it's so hard to be a man now. It's so hard to be a man now. And so that sort of rears back up. And my hope is that, this is kind of a dying last gasp, right? Like we've all seen the monster movies where the thing is almost dead and then it comes back, angrily for sort of the last big aggressive thing. I think that's the hopeful spin, but I think that's where it's coming from. And I think really, this is going to be up to the younger generations. I think what we're seeing with Gen Z is fascinating. I think it's fascinating that what's driving this is an extremely toxic strain from young Gen Z men, but it is definitely not all young Gen Z men. And I have spent my kids are Generation Alpha, but I've spent a lot of time with Gen Z folks, and I think it's a fascinating generation, and I think it's an incredible generation. If you think about Gen Z, we have really screwed this generation. They were the generation that we gave them iPads in their cribs. They were the generation that were patient zero for having all social media accounts, and we had no idea what it would do to them in terms of cyberbullying and mental health and loneliness and all of those things.
And neural pathways, I always point out, we don't even know that.
Totally. They were the generation that, COVID and lockdown hit them at crucial times. They're the generation that is inheriting a terrible planet. If you think about all the things, it's really squarely fallen on Gen Z. And truly, there's been massive mental health crises on Gen Z as a result. But the kids who have come out of this hole are really amazing. And they have amazing mental health language and talking about boundaries and talking about processing. They are emotionally wise beyond their years. And I think they are one of the best equipped generations for dealing with extremely complex things. And I think, yes, there is this strain of toxic masculinity that has gotten reignited in Gen Z in a extreme way. But there's one of these things where it's at least it's out in the open. At least it's not buried. At least they're not pretending they're good guys. And I think let's see what the rest of Gen Z does with it. Let's see what Gen Z women do with it and Gen Z non-toxic guys do with it. And let's see what Gen Alpha does. I mean, the future's going to be in those generations' hands, no matter what you or I think about it.
A lot of those Gen Z young men are feeling that they're not getting jobs because women are getting jobs ahead of them, or they're not getting jobs because people of color are getting jobs ahead of them. I'm talking obviously about white males now. But those kind of things are part of the whole equation, aren't they?
Well, one of the things that's interesting, and I did actually talk about this in my book, women have made inroads into typically male-dominated jobs.
Yes.
Men have not made inroads into
That's
typically
right.
female-dominated jobs because they're toxically masculine and they don't want to. They don't want to do a nurse job. They don't want to do a teacher job. That's a woman's job. Some of this is on them.
Well, there are more men now that are nurses than I think previously, like even a decade
But
ago.
statistically, that's part of the
Flight
reason.
attendants,
That's part of the
yeah.
reason because women do not have this baggage of, oh my gosh, this somehow threatens me to do a masculine job, where men have this baggage of, this threatens me to do. I mean, toxic masculinity hurts men. That's the thing. It hurts everyone.
Agree. Let's talk a little bit about entrepreneurship. Can you really make profit out of chaos? Because I think, Musk and Trump may be thinking that there's chaos every day, it seems now. That redounds back to the bros again, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, that's Silicon Valley's love language, is making profit out of chaos. I mean, here's my view, and I have to kind of squint at the news for 30 minutes a day, because it is intentionally what they're doing is throwing so much at the wall to enrage and distract everyone. What worries me is what we're not reading in the headlines every day, because there is a massive sideshow going on in the headlines every day. And there's a bunch of stuff we're not seeing that I think there's a distraction going on in the headlines every day. What worries me is what we're not seeing in the headlines. That to me is probably the real story. But yeah, whenever there's chaos, there's profit to be made. That is the story of Silicon Valley. It's the story of emerging markets. It's the story of downtimes. When everything's up and to the right, everyone's making money. When everything is a depression, no one's making money. Silicon Valley loves when it's choppy, because that's when you can steal other people's money. That's when you can steal pie. That's when you can, get more than your fair share. That's when it becomes a game, because that's, really what drives a lot of these people. It's the gamesmanship of it. It's the how much can I get, but how much can I get? And I don't even mean that to be greedy. It's more like it's a RPG.
You know what else drives money and profit? I remember as a boy, I was very enamored of Gone with the Wind, and I identified with Red Butler. Didn't realize till I was a little older that I was more like Ashley Wilkes. But Red Butler said, the way you make money is not only when things kind of go to hell, but when there's war and when there's conflict and when there's problems that burst out in, well, I think what he's saying is violence.
Yeah, give people a good enemy.
What about your most recent book, Uterus, Not a Bug? What were you trying to say in that title?
So that book was about, here's what prompted that book. A book I never thought I would write. I tell you that before I had children. I'm Gen X. And when I went to college, there was this whole thing. It was a cover of Newsweek, and it was called it was like this whole opt-out myth, where it was this idea that there was no sexism. The reason that working mothers weren't having careers is because biologically, when they had children, something changed in them and they decided they wanted to opt out of the workforce. There was supposedly this scientific study that proved this. This has been wildly debunked. It just so happened all of these women who decided to opt out were treated absolutely terribly at work and had no support at home. And they opted out because they were in a terrible situation. This has been wildly debunked. At any rate, that imprinted on me dramatically in my early 20s. And again, I was raised with this mother who kind of felt cheated out of her career. And, so I was extremely I wouldn't even say ambitious, because I don't think it was about money or power. I loved what I did. I loved being a journalist. It was such a core part of my identity. And the idea that I would have children and somehow that would no longer matter to me, and that part of me would change terrified me on an existential basis. It was like one day I would wake up and not be myself. It felt like it would be like an invasion of the body snatchers moment. And so even though, I got married, I'd been married, I think, for 10 years or so when I got pregnant. And I thought I probably wanted to have kids. I put it off for a very long time because I thought, and I was the breadwinner for my household. I didn't have the luxury of not working, frankly. And I just thought, this is so existentially terrifying to one day. It's like a Stepford wife thing. I'm going to one day and have my whole personality wiped. And so I thought, I got to do everything I've ever wanted to accomplish. So I was like, I helped build TechCrunch. I worked at a national magazine. I hosted, an on-camera show. I wrote a book. I had to do everything so that when this happened, at least I would have professionally achieved everything I wanted to do. And then I kind of held my breath, and I had children. I felt like I was diffusing a bomb and counting to 10. And, I had Eli. And as I said, I looked at Eli, and it took Eli, and we raised $2.5 million together. Like, I hardly became less ambitious. In fact, I became more ambitious. And in terms of being a journalist, I became more fearless. I became more aggressive. My writing voice became sharper. My net worth increased. I became better at everything. And I was like, wow, what a lie. What a lie. And what if I had actually never had children because I so believed that lie? And so I wanted to write a book out there for women like me who had been lied to. And I also sat back and thought, giving birth is such an incredible sort of physical thing that we're able to do. And how have we bought the lie that this is weakness? Like, if men did this, it would be live streamed on ESPN and sponsored by Gatorade. Like, this is like one of the most supernaturally difficult, incredible things human beings can do. Like, I am growing a freaking human being. And I've been gaslit to think this is weakness. Like, this is ridiculous. And so I was like, no. And, because I'm a journalist, it's like I got all this like data and research and how productive women get. And then I went to like countries like Iceland, which, at the time was like the number one in the Economist Glass Ceilings Index for women. Like, how does it work here? And it was like I'd gone to the moon. Like, the working women in Iceland were like, what? When I would tell them about like what happens in America. And I was like, what? When they were like, tell me again about stay-at-home moms, like wildly different. So that's what I set out to do, because it was like a sliding doors moment. It was just like, and by the way, I am not one of these people who's like, oh, everyone should have children. I think I could have had a lovely, fulfilling life without children as much as I love my children. I do not think it's everyone's path. But I do think people, if someone wants to have children and that is their path, and they think that they can't because someone has told them somehow they'll be biologically changed in a way a man won't, like, that's just BS.
Well, what's coming through for me loud and clear is you became the woman your mother could not become.
Oh, what a lovely way of saying that, Michael.
I think you've already said it. It's right in the subtext of what you said. It's pretty clear to me, abundantly clear to me.
Well, but you said it in a better way. Thank you. That's lovely.
Yeah. So how did you get into the bookstore business?
So my partner, Paul, we're both writers. And so we bought a second house in Palm Springs. We spent more time here during the pandemic. San Francisco is still my primary home, but we go back and forth. And we, this really kind of became a safe haven for our family for a number of reasons, and particularly for our kids. And we had bought this second home in 2019, right before the pandemic. So, which, jumped in value because everyone was coming to Palm Springs. And so, we felt really a lot of sense of love for the city, and we wanted to do something nice for the city. And we looked around and we were shocked to find out the city did not have a bookstore, which is kind of shocking because Palm Springs is really a place, it's thought of as a place for retirees. It's not only a place for retirees, but it is a place that you tend to move to when you want to have a slower pace of life or you want to slow down a bit. And even people who have second homes, this is where they come to kind of decompress, right? And so there's a lot of heavy readers here. And then, it's a town of only 40,000 residents, but 10 million people come here to read by a pool. And there's no bookstore, which is sort of astounding. And so we just thought the best thing that we could do for the city was to give it a bookstore. So because our house had appreciated in value, we took out a second mortgage on our house and pulled out, I think, $150,000 of our house and opened a bookstore. And we thought this will be a fun thing to do with our daughters. And because it'd be a business that's very tactile that they could do with us. And we jokingly called it the best bookstore in Palm Springs because there was no bookstore in Palm Springs, and opened it downtown. It's about 1,000 square feet. And we thought, it will be sort of lucky to break even. And I mean, in the first year in business, we did 7 figures of revenue. It's one of the most profitable bookstores per square foot in America.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
very exciting and good news, especially to would-be entrepreneurs. Bookstores can be tough business to run, though. I remember talking about it with Louise Erdrich, who has a bookstore in North Dakota, and Elaine Petrocelli here in the Bay Area is a good friend. There are a lot of burdens to being a bookstore owner.
Well, fortunately, our previous businesses we did were investigative journalism and then with Chairman Mom trying to sort of solve workplace equality. So if you've done those, doing a bookstore is comparatively easy.
So what's the deal with Barnes & Noble moving in the neighborhood?
So this just came out today. There's been a rumor, and actually it was not just a rumor, it was based on it. Barnes & Noble was having, so for 10 years, Palm Springs has not had a bookstore. For 10 years. We pull money out. We pull 6 figures of debt out of our home and prove that Palm Springs is this multi-million-dollar market, sleeper market, right? And so then Barnes & Noble looks at it and goes, well, that looks good. So Barnes & Noble has 8 or 9 conversations with a developer to not only open a bookstore in Palm Springs, but literally across the parking lot from us. Like literally across the parking lot from us. This is a town of 40,000 people. Like this is a tiny, tiny town. So we start getting these awkward phone calls from like local journalists, from people attached to the city. And it's like this, like people kept calling me and they're like, hey. And it's like the call that you get, it's like when someone has to tell you like your spouse is cheating on you. Like no one wants to be the one to deliver this news to me. And I'm just like, oh my God. And it's like, at first it's kind of like, well, that sucks. But then it's like, you know me and Paul from journalism days. And it's like, okay, well, I guess this is another Uber. Like, it's like we've taken on bigger things than a local Barnes & Noble. And the beauty is like we have this annex on the side of our parking lot that was like would have been right next to this Barnes & Noble that has these windows. So we were going to just put signs in the window that say like independent bookstore this way, private equity owned bookstore that way. Like we were going to offer the Barnes & Noble employees a bigger employee discount to come to our bookstore. We were going to hire like sidewalk chalk artists to do it was going to be like so ridiculously on. This was going to be a story on CNN. This was going to be on the New York Times, like real life, You've Got Mail. Like they were not going to know what had hit them. This was going to be so ridiculous. Our daughters were in on it. Like the whole family was like so geared up for this fight to just David and Goliath the hell out of this in this tiny town because they were opening up across the parking lot. It was ridiculous. And this is we have the most loyal customer base in this town because they didn't have a bookstore for 10 years. And we borrowed money to give them a bookstore. People come in our bookstore every day thanking us like they weren't going to have this shit. Anyway, so we found out today that it is not happening. And finally, we told one of the local journalists, like, you got to write about this because we can't keep getting these calls from people. And so anyway, the story broke today that indeed it is not happening.
But despite all the fun you were ready to have, you must be relieved.
I am relieved because I have a lot going on with 2 teenage girls and I did not need the fight. I think Paul is half relieved. I think Paul was ready to have another fight. I think he misses them from the journalism days. I think my daughters are bummed. I think they wanted the fight.
Yeah, and your daughters could have had some outlet for all that adolescent hormonal
stuff. That is
stuff.
Literally what I wrote in my newsletter today, to the bookstore newsletter. I was like, you think Paul and I like fights? Imagine 2 hormone-filled teenagers looking to rail at something. And it literally was on like, today is, Blackout Against Corporations Economic Friday. It's like, what a day for that to have, if it had been confirmed. But we get all of the positioning of this. We could have done this without actually having to do it, which is also fun.
Well, we don't know what's going to happen with all these tariffs that are being levied by Trump and all the rest of it to the economy. But it sounds like, again, I'm going back to what you said earlier, Gen X in your mind may be what can save us?
Well, Gen Z. No, I'm Gen X. We're not doing anything.
I mean, Gen Z, excuse me.
We're sitting back with a martini, shaking our heads.
Yeah.
No, Gen Z. No, I have high hopes for Gen Z. I think Gen Z is actually amazing. And look, I think Gen Alpha as well. I can't speak for sort of all of Gen Alpha parents everywhere, but I think certainly the Gen Alpha parents I know, it's like we all learned a lesson from Gen Z. It's like my kids don't have phones until high school. My kids don't have social media accounts. It's like we learned from watching. And so I do think a lot of the Gen Alpha kids are sidestepping a lot of what happened to Gen Z. Unfortunately, Gen Z were kind of the sacrificial lambs. But every Gen Z kid I have either hired at the bookstore or mentored if they're doing something in journalism or in writing, they are the most incredible kids who are just wise and emotionally mature beyond their years. I have high hopes.
You may be getting the best kids, though, coming to work at your bookstore. It may be a selective process, self-selective process. But what's the future for tech journalism in your judgment?
I don't know because honestly, I could not. I would not advise anyone I love to go into it.
Because?
It's terrible. There's chunks of my soul that will never grow back, and I got out of it as it was getting toxic.
You mean because of everything that's happening now around us?
Yeah, this is the problem with tech journalism. We now are in a world where no one believes in the truth, and there's no shared sense of truth. So when I was coming up in tech journalism, there was this situation where you would work really hard for not very much money. You were trying to figure out the truth in a situation where there were billions of dollars at stake. So people would lie, cheat, steal, manipulate, do anything to keep the truth from coming out because there's billions of dollars at stake. They would do anything to keep this. It was very, very hard to figure out what the truth was. And you would go to all these links to try to figure it out. It was such a hard job. You'd get the story out there and, you'd have threats, you'd have all of this, right? You get it out there, you go through this gauntlet, you're not paid well, you haven't slept, but at least you write a story that makes a difference. At least you write a story that people believe that moves the needle. Now you don't. Because first of all, Mark Andreessen, through funding Substack, has destroyed newsrooms because he's taken all the best reporters out of everything, and everyone has their tiny Substack, so no one has any influence. No one's reading a shared, there's no shared thing everyone's reading like you used to have with TechCrunch or, the business page of the New York Times. There's 1,000 tiny little voices. So there's no one thing that has influence. But also no one believes anything. And so it's like someone looks at the equivalent of that article, which used to be able to fundamentally change an industry, send shockwaves through an industry. And the people who already believed it are like, yeah, sounds right. They go about their day. They already thought that. And the people who don't want to believe it go, oh, fake news. So you go through all that and it does nothing for you. And then it's totally okay to now threaten and terrorize those people's families. To what end? What are you accomplishing? What are you accomplishing?
Any advice for us since we're thinking about joining up with Substack?
Well, it will not surprise you to hear I'm not a massive Substack fan because they have subsidized a lot of anti-trans rights accounts. So they are not my favorite. But I do think that they've built an incredible product. And I think that, it's given a lot of people amazing voices. And I think Substack has been the biggest beneficiary of X imploding. You've got your fans, though. You're a legend. You don't need any help.
A few. Well, let me, first of all, thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I invite you to join by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes. That's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And my thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks to this week's guest, Sarah Lacy.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad you didn't retire after KQED. It's always good hearing your dulcet tones.
Thank you for that. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.